He had imagined her small and delicate with gentle hands that would tend his garden and soft words that would fill the silence of his lonely ranch. But when the dust settled from the wagon wheels, Sloan found himself staring up at a woman who could probably lift him with one arm. Will Blaine stood 6 feet tall in her worn boots with shoulders broader than most men in town and hands that looked like they could handle a plow better than a teacup. The letter in his pocket suddenly felt like a cruel joke, and the wedding ring he had carved from oak seemed impossibly small. 3 months earlier, had placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper with shaking hands. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life. Must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He had received only one response written in careful script that spoke of loneliness matching his own. Willa's letters had painted pictures of cozy meals and shared conversations of someone who understood the weight of solitude that pressed down on isolated homesteads. Never once had she mentioned that she stood taller than his barn door. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had arranged the meeting, cleared his throat nervously as he climbed down from the wagon driver's seat. His eyes darted between EMTT's stunned expression and Will's imposing figure. The woman herself seemed equally surprised, her confident posture faltering as she took in EMTT's slight frame, and the way he had to crane his neck to meet her gaze. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in the dusty yard like actors who had forgotten their lines. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. EMTT felt the curious stares of his neighbors who had gathered to witness the arrival of his mail-order bride. Mrs. Henderson from the general store whispered something to her husband behind her hand. Young Tommy Morrison actually pointed before his mother yanked his arm down. The whole scene felt like a public spectacle gone wrong, and Emmett's cheeks burned with embarrassment that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Willa finally spoke, her voice deeper than he had expected, but not unkind. "You must be Emmett." She extended a hand that engulfed his own when he reluctantly offered it. Her grip was firm but careful, as if she was aware of her own strength. "I suppose we should talk." The way she said it suggested she was having the same doubts that were racing through his mind. Fletcher Knox sensed the tension and quickly busied himself unloading Willa's single trunk from the wagon bed. It was larger than EMTT had anticipated, reinforcing the growing realization that nothing about this arrangement was going to match his expectations. The merchant's hurried movements betrayed his own discomfort with the awkward situation he had helped create. But as EMTT watched Willa survey his modest ranch with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than disappointment, something unexpected happened. She didn't wrinkle her nose at the simple cabin or the patches in the corral fence. Instead, she nodded approvingly at his well-tended vegetable garden and the neat stack of firewood by the porch. Whatever shock she felt at his appearance, she was keeping it to herself with a grace he hadn't expected from someone who looked like she could break him in half. The morning after Willa's arrival brought a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Emmett's prize bull, Dakota, had somehow broken through the reinforced fence during the night and was now standing defiantly in the middle of Ms. Henderson's prized flower garden 3 properties over. The massive animal was systematically destroying months of careful cultivation, and the sound of Mrs. Henderson's furious shouting could be heard clear across the valley. EMTT stood at his porch railing, wringing his hands as he watched the disaster unfold. Dakota weighed nearly 2,000 pounds and had the temperament of a storm cloud on the best of days. The bull had already charged 2 of the neighbor men who had tried to approach, sending them scrambling over fences in undignified retreat. The situation was quickly becoming the kind of neighborhood scandal that would follow EMTT for years. "You can't rope him from here," Willa observed calmly from beside him. She had appeared at his elbow without him noticing, moving with surprising quiet for someone her size. Her eyes were fixed on the bull with an expression that EMTT couldn't quite read. "And those men down there are going to get themselves trampled if they keep approaching from the front like that." EMTT nodded miserably. "Dakota's always been stubborn, but never like this. I don't know what got into him." The truth was, he had been dreading this exact scenario since the day he bought the bull. He had neither the physical strength nor the experience to handle such a large animal when it decided to be uncooperative. Most of his neighbors knew it, which made the current situation even more humiliating. Without warning, Willa stepped off the porch and began walking toward the chaos with long, purposeful strides. EMTT hurried after her, his shorter legs working double time to keep up. Willow, wait, he's dangerous when he's agitated like this. You shouldn't. But she was already halfway across the field. Her attention focused entirely on the rampaging bull. As they approached Mrs. Henderson's property, EMTT could see the full extent of the damage. Roses that had taken 3 years to establish were trampled into the dirt. The carefully arranged border stones had been scattered like toys. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on her front steps, her face red with fury, directing a stream of accusations at anyone within earshot. When she spotted EMTT approaching, her voice rose another octave. "That monster of yours has destroyed everything," she shrieked. "Look at my garden. Just look at it. You're going to pay for every single plant, EMTT Sloan. And if you can't control your livestock, you have no business keeping them." The other neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. Willa ignored the commotion entirely. She studied Dakota's movements with the kind of focused attention usually reserved for reading difficult text. The bull was pawing the ground near what remained of a rose bush, his massive head lowered in a way that suggested he was preparing for another charge. 2 more men had arrived with ropes, but they stood at a safe distance, clearly reluctant to get within range of those wicked-looking horns. Then Willa did something that made Emmett's heart stop. She climbed over the fence and began walking directly toward the agitated animal, her hands empty and her movements slow but confident. The crowd fell silent, watching in fascination and horror as this impossibly tall woman approached the beast that had sent grown men running for cover. Even Mrs. Henderson stopped her tirade, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. Dakota's massive head swung toward Willa as she approached, his nostrils flaring with each heavy breath. The bull's eyes rolled wide at the edges, a sure sign of an animal pushed beyond reason. EMTT felt his throat constrict as he watched his mail-order bride walk calmly into what looked like certain death. Every instinct screamed at him to call out, to stop her, but something in her deliberate movements kept him frozen in place. Will began speaking to the bull in a low, steady voice that carried just far enough for EMTT to catch fragments. She wasn't using the sharp, commanding tone most people employed with livestock. Instead, her words flowed like water over stones, rhythmic and soothing. Dakota's ears twitched forward and his pawing gradually slowed. The crowd of onlookers held their collective breath as woman and beast regarded each other across 10 feet of trampled garden. "Easy there, big fellow," Willa murmured, extending one hand palm up in Dakota's direction. "You're not really angry, are you? Just confused and far from home." She took another step closer, and MTT's heart hammered against his ribs. The bull could charge at any moment, and there was nowhere for her to run in Mrs. Henderson's enclosed garden space. But Dakota didn't charge. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The massive animal's breathing began to even out, and his aggressive posture relaxed incrementally. Will continued her approach, never breaking eye contact, never hurrying her movements. When she was close enough to touch him, she reached out and placed her hand on his enormous neck right behind his left ear. The effect was immediate and startling. Dakota's head dropped lower and a sound that was almost like a sigh escaped from his chest. Willa began scratching behind his ear with practiced fingers and the bull actually leaned into her touch like an oversized dog seeking affection. The transformation was so complete that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. "Someone fetch a lead rope," Willa called over her shoulder without taking her eyes off Dakota. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Fletcher Knox scrambled to comply, returning quickly with a length of sturdy rope from EMTT's barn. Willa fashioned a simple halter with movements so smooth they seemed rehearsed. Within minutes, she was leading Dakota out of the ruined garden as docilely as a lamb. The bull followed her without resistance, his earlier aggression completely forgotten. The assembled neighbors parted like water before them, their faces showing a mixture of amazement and bewilderment. Mrs. Henderson stood speechless on her porch steps, her prepared speech about livestock control dying unspoken on her lips. As they passed EMTT, Willa caught his eye and offered a small smile that transformed her entire face. For the first time since her arrival, he saw past her intimidating size to something warmer underneath. "Your fence has a weak post on the north corner," she said casually, as if taming rampaging bulls was something she did every morning before breakfast. We should probably fix that before he decides to take another walk. Word of Willa's feat with the bull spread through the settlement faster than wildfire and dry grass. By afternoon, a steady stream of neighbors had found excuses to visit MTT's ranch. Their curiosity barely concealed behind offers of welcome meals and gardening advice. Each visitor cast furtive glances at Willa as she worked alongside Emmett to repair the damaged fence. Their whispered conversations creating an undercurrent of speculation that made him increasingly uncomfortable. The attention reached a peak when Samuel Morrison arrived with his 3 sons in tow, ostensibly to help with the fence work, but clearly more interested in getting a closer look at the woman who had tamed Dakota with her bare hands. Morrison was the kind of man who measured everything by physical strength and found Emmett lacking in most departments. His presence always made EMTT feel smaller than he already was. "Heard your lady friend has a way with livestock," Morrison commented, leaning against the fence post with studied casualness. His boys arranged themselves behind him like an audience, their eyes fixed on Willa as she drove fence posts into the hard ground with powerful swings of a heavy sledgehammer. Each blow sent the post deeper than EMTT could have managed with twice as many swings. EMTT felt heat creep up his neck as Morrison's implications became clear. The man was questioning whether EMTT could provide for and protect a woman of Willa's obvious capabilities. It was the same doubt that had been gnawing at his own confidence since her arrival. But hearing it voiced by someone else made it sting twice as sharp. "Willa grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana," EMTT replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "She knows her way around animals." It was true as far as it went, though he had learned this fact only that morning when she mentioned it while examining Dakota's temperament. Her letters had spoken of wanting a quiet life, but they had never detailed the experiences that had shaped her into someone capable of handling a 2,000-pound bull without breaking a sweat. Morrison's eldest son, a strapping young man of 19, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from never having been physically challenged by life. "Maybe she'd like some help with that post-hole digger," he offered, his voice carrying the assumption that his assistance would be both welcome and necessary. "Looks like heavy work for," he trailed off, apparently realizing that commenting on Willa's gender might not be wise, given what they had all witnessed that morning. Willa looked up from her work, sweat glistening on her forehead despite the relatively cool temperature. Her expression was polite but distant as she considered the young man's offer. "I appreciate the thought," she said, "but I've got my rhythm now. Might be better if you helped EMTT with stretching the wire." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, but there was something in it that discouraged further offers of assistance. The rejection stung the boy's pride in a way that was immediately visible. His shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched as he realized that this unusual woman had no need for his strength or protection. Morrison's other sons exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective confusion regarding the proper social dynamics of the situation. EMTT watched the interaction with growing unease. He could see the wheels turning in Morrison's head, the calculations being made about power and perception and community standing. Men like Morrison lived by clear rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Willa's presence disrupted those rules in ways that made some people uncomfortable. But what troubled EMTT most was his own reaction. Part of him was proud of Willa's competence and independence. Another part wondered if her strength highlighted his own inadequacies in ways that would become impossible to ignore. That evening, as the last of the curious neighbors finally departed, EMTT found himself alone with Willa for the first time since her arrival. The silence between them felt heavier than the humid air that preceded a thunderstorm. They sat on opposite ends of his small porch. The space between them measured not just in feet, but in the weight of unspoken doubts and mismatched expectations. Willa broke the silence first, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been there when she faced down the bull. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but rather staring out at the darkening horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. Her profile was strong and angular, nothing like the delicate features he had imagined during those long months of correspondence. EMTT shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking under his slight weight. "I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure what exactly he could have written. That he was smaller than most men, that he sometimes felt lost on his own ranch, that he had placed the advertisement not out of confidence, but out of desperate loneliness. About what? Will turned to face him, and her directness caught him off guard. About being shorter than average, about having neighbors who measure a man's worth by how much weight he can lift. There was no mockery in her voice, but there was a sharp understanding that made EMTT wonder what experiences had taught her to recognize such things so quickly. The honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response about feeling like I'm not enough. He said quietly, not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life I'm trying to build. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Accurate and impossible to take back. Willow was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a slow rhythm against the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness that surprised him. You know what I saw today when you watched me with Dakota? She didn't wait for his answer. I saw a man who cared more about my safety than his own embarrassment. Most men would have stopped me, would have insisted on handling it themselves, even if they got hurt in the process. EMTT felt something loosen in his chest, though he wasn't sure if it was relief or something more complicated. And what I should have written, Willa continued, was that I'm tired of being seen as a curiosity or a challenge, that I've spent my whole life having people assume I must be looking for someone to prove their strength against mine. The revelation shifted something fundamental in how EMTT saw their situation. All day he had been focused on what he lacked, on how he didn't measure up to some imagined standard. But Willa's words suggested that she had her own burdens to carry, her own reasons for seeking a life away from the judgments of others. So what do we do now? He asked, genuine curiosity replacing the anxiety that had plagued him since her arrival. Willa reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked worn from repeated handling. Do you remember what you wrote in your third letter? She asked, unfolding it carefully in the dim porch light. You said that you believed real partnership meant two people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel smaller. EMTT did remember writing those words, though they had seemed almost foolishly idealistic when he penned them by lamplight months ago. He had worried that such sentiment might drive away potential respondents who expected more traditional arrangements. Now hearing them quoted back to him, they sounded like a promise he wasn't sure he knew how to keep. I meant it when I wrote it, he said slowly. But I'm not sure I understood what it would look like in practice. He gestured toward the fence they had repaired together, where her competence had been so evident beside his own struggles. Today made me realize how much I don't know about my own land, my own animals. Will refolded the letter and tucked it away, but not before EMTT caught sight of other papers in her pocket. More of his letters, he realized, kept, and apparently reread enough to show where. The thought that his words had been important enough to preserve, gave him an unexpected surge of something that might have been hope. You know what I noticed today? Will asked, shifting in her chair to face him more directly. When Dakota got loose, you didn't run to get help from Morrison or any of the other men. You came to find me. That tells me something about who you are when the pretenses fall away. EMTT hadn't thought about his actions in those terms. But she was right. When crisis struck, his instinct had been to turn to her. Not because he expected her to solve his problems, but because somehow he had sensed that she would understand what needed to be done. It was a level of trust that surprised him given how recently they had met. In my last letter, Willa continued, I wrote that I was tired of being alone. But I didn't just mean physically alone. I meant being alone with my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams for what life could be like if I found the right person to share it with. She paused, studying his face in the gathering darkness. I think maybe we both advertise for someone to rescue us from loneliness. But what we might actually need is someone to be lonely with sometimes and strong with other times. The distinction she was drawing felt important, though Emmett wasn't entirely sure he grasped all its implications. Traditional marriage arrangements in their community seemed to follow predictable patterns. The man provided protection and resources. The woman provided domestic skills and companionship. What Willow was suggesting sounded more complex and more honest than those familiar roles. So, we try, he said finally. We try to figure out what partnership looks like when it doesn't fit the usual patterns. It wasn't a question, but, well, nodded anyway, her expression serious but not without warmth. But first, she said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt. You're going to show me how you plan to propose because technically we're still just two strangers who happen to be sharing a porch. Her tone was light, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the formality mattered to her more than she was letting on. EMTT felt his pulse quicken as he realized she was right. In all the confusion and awkwardness of her arrival, they had never actually addressed the